Some of Alaska's citizens, our friends, neighbors, relatives, and elders, are being deprived of their human rights to make their own decisions, to personal safety, to socialize and communicate with whom they choose, to their money and property, to basic freedoms and dignity. Abuse of vulnerable adults deprives them of basic human rights. Some of us are in a position to be the first to notice when there's a problem, and we've been asked to assume a special duty to be on the lookout for signs of these abuses and to report it immediately whenever abuse is suspected. In Alaska, we decided it was so important, we wrote these rules into law and formed a special agency, Adult Protective Services, specifically to handle these types of situations. Unfortunately, only 1 in 5 cases is ever reported, leaving 4 out of 5 unresolved. Watching this video is your first step in helping. You'll make a positive difference in your community by protecting the rights of its most vulnerable citizens. First, we're going to clarify some of the terms we use to describe the problem. Then, we'll talk about how these issues sometimes reveal themselves and what you can do to bring them to a halt for good. A vulnerable adult is someone who is 18 years of age or older, who because of a physical or mental impairment is unable to meet their own needs or seek help without assistance. The word abuse usually refers to physical pain or mental distress, but it can also mean verbal abuse, sexual abuse, involuntary seclusion, or using someone else's property. Anyone who discovers signs of any kind of abuse can and should report it immediately. But certain of us are in unique positions to see the signs before others and are required by Alaska law to report signs of abuse within 24 hours of first having cause for the belief. These include professionals in fields like health occupation and public safety occupations. If you're unsure whether you are required to report, ask your employer or call Adult Protective Services to find out. Simply telling an employer does not fulfill your requirement with the state. So what exactly needs to be reported? Well, the state of Alaska asks that we report any incident or suspected incident in which a vulnerable adult suffers harm from abandonment, abuse, exploitation, neglect, or self-neglect.
Dolly is a young adult with a developmental disability. She is a resident of an assisted living center to get the care she requires. Her mom visits most days and weekends. In her frequent visits, she has noticed some developments at the center that have resulted in staff turnover. Mom also notices some attitude shift in Dolly, but believes it must be a result of the staff changes. The staff interaction and oversight, however, have made Mom suspicious. Eventually, Dolly shows fear and does not want her mom to leave. She tells her of having to do bad things. It's at this time that Mom notices the signs of physical abuse. Mom immediately meets with the director of the center to investigate the matter further and to begin a report to the Adult Protective Services.
We're going to go through the various kinds of abuse and talk briefly about the most common signs that should send up a red flag and help you decide that a report should definitely be made. We'll start with what can often be the most obvious form: physical abuse. Caregivers and others may notice unexplained bruising, complaints of pain, or crying. We may see broken assistive devices like glasses or dentures. The vulnerable adult may have a drastic change in emotional state or have unexplained or untreated injuries in various stages of healing by rough handling or forcing. Physical abuse includes taking property or services that are necessary for his or her well-being. The next form, mental abuse, includes things like humiliation, harassment, or threats, and might be indicated by a person being fearful or statements about not being allowed to do certain things. A form of mental abuse is verbal abuse. It is another way of harming a vulnerable adult. Sexual abuse includes, but is not limited to, sexual harassment, sexual coercion, or sexual assault. Signs may include pain or bruises around the breasts or genital area, forced abortion, sterilization, or pregnancy, unwanted touching or display of private parts, tricking or manipulating into sexual activity. In the case of involuntary seclusion, the vulnerable adult's absence may be the only sign of a problem.
Joe is an elder in a small Alaska village. He has always been a friendly and social neighbor. But his son recently returned to live with him in the village, and there seemed to be some changes in Joe since his arrival. Our local public safety officer has noticed Joe being less social recently. The PSO knows that the son has bought lots of new things on Joe's accounts. They're the type of things that Joe has never bought for himself in the past, and that he certainly doesn't seem to need now. Our PSO decides to check in on Joe at a time when he knows the son will not be around. He finds that Joe's home is terribly neglected and that Joe is ill and weak. The PSO questions Joe about the purchases and his seclusion. Joe tells our PSO that none of these changes are his idea, but rather his son's. After making sure that Joe is all right, the PSO makes a report with Adult Protective Services.
Exploitation can take many forms, but it always involves use of a vulnerable adult's things with no significant benefit to the adult. They are entitled to protection from misuse of power of attorney, financial neglect by guardians, bad friends and family, and unfair dealing. Signs of misappropriation of a person's property may include food, money, medications, or other needed supplies. The vulnerable adult may complain of unwanted people moving into his or her house, of missing monies or resources, or unpaid bills. Abandonment is the desertion of a vulnerable adult by a caregiver. Failure to stay with the person in an emergency room or doctor's office when he or she is unable to communicate his or her own needs is an example of abandonment and could be a tip-off to a deeper problem.
Roy has recently become a widower and lives alone. His adult children have started providing some professional services to help take care of him, including Anchor Ride's ride service for important appointments. Our driver has noticed a change in Roy over the course of several pickups. Roy has rapidly lost weight and seems to be more confused with each pickup. He is clearly physically weaker each time. On other occasions, Roy refuses to answer the door and has suspiciously canceled his ride. Already concerned for Roy's health, on another scheduled pickup, our driver notices lots of trash and several days' worth of newspapers on the porch. Again, no answer at the door. It's at this time that our driver calls APS to report suspected self-abuse.
Neglect is the intentional failure by a caregiver to provide care or services to maintain the health of a vulnerable adult. Clear examples are inadequate food, water, or medication, lack of personal care, such as dressing appropriately for weather conditions or failure to change soiled bedding, isolation from needed medical care, from other family or friends, mental stimulation, or emotional support. They may show as malnutrition, dehydration, untreated bed sores, or poor personal hygiene, deterioration of health, signs of drugging or under medication, or unsanitary or unsafe living conditions. When the vulnerable adult is acting as his or her own caregiver, these signs may point to self-neglect. In most cases, the first thing APS does is contact one of its people in the area. APS works with and trains other state agencies and community service providers around the state to provide protective services. As much as possible, protective services will be provided in a culturally relevant manner that protects the vulnerable adult's right to the least restrictive environment and maximizes that person's own decision-making capabilities. Here are some good examples of how APS helps in the least restrictive way. To file a report with APS, mandatory reporters are encouraged to use the Report of Harm for the Protection of Vulnerable Adults. It's in PDF form on the web at the Division of Senior and Disability Services website. Navigate to Adult Protective Services in the section sidebar on the right of this home page. Scroll down APS's homepage to find the link titled Report Harm to a Vulnerable Adult. Should this form be unavailable for any reason, do not delay reporting. The law requires mandatory reporters like us to report within 24 hours. Reports of harm can also be faxed to 907-269-3648. You may also call in your report. Beside those people and agencies the state requires, your report is kept confidential and is not subject to public inspection. Adult Protective Services will always start with the least impactful solution. Their guiding principles say that when interests compete, their job is to serve the adult client. Not the community concerned about safety, not the landlord concerned about property, not other citizens concerned about crime or morality, or even other family members concerned about their own health or finances. APS will tell you themselves that they believe freedom is more important than safety, that a person can choose to live in harm or even self-destructively, provided he or she has the capacity to choose, does not harm others, and commits no crime. It is only when someone's rights are taken away by another person or people, or by disabling mental illness, that APS steps in. Adult Protective Services seeks to achieve simultaneously and in order of importance freedom, safety, the least disruption of lifestyle, and least restrictive care option possible. Some of Alaska's citizens do not enjoy the most basic of human rights. Some of us are in unique positions to be the first to notice when there's a problem, and we've been asked to assume a special responsibility, to be on the lookout for the signs, and to report it immediately whenever abuse is suspected. Assume that you are responsible. Multiple reports are much better than none. Remember, right now, only 1 in 5 incidents of abuse is being reported. We think we can do better than that. The more we report abuse, the more people are aware of the problem, and awareness leads to prevention. The law says we have to report or we could lose our licenses. But that's not why we do it. We're in the jobs we're in because we care about people, and we want to help when we see something's wrong. We don't report because the law says to. It's just the right thing to do. It's how we directly make a difference in our community. A real, positive, visible difference. And as its communities go, so goes the whole state of Alaska. This is how APS is making Alaska a safer place for vulnerable adults.